Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leonard Stewart, and I'd like to welcome you to Goffstown Today. It's a local public affairs series that's being brought to you by the Goffstown Democratic Committee. Our goal with these programs, which we started about a year ago, is to provide meaningful discussions of local and state issues of importance to the greater Goffstown community. Our special guest today is Stephanie Savard, a very busy woman who is simultaneously the director of the New Hampshire Coalition to End Homelessness and the Chief External Relations Officer of Families in Transition, a nonprofit organization whose stated mission is to prevent and break the cycle of homelessness. Ms. Savard, a graduate of Keene State College with a master's degree in social work from Boston University, is closing in on 25 years of service in various leadership roles with families in transition. So there's perhaps no one better to describe the scope and scale of the homelessness in New Hampshire than she. Outside of a few recent stories we've seen about homeless camp removals in Manchester and Nashua, it's a subject that's drawn very little attention. Ms. Savard, thank you for being with us on Goffstown Today. To start
Thank you so much for having me, Len.
Well, we appreciate you being here. Just how widespread is homelessness in New Hampshire? Is it increasing? And I'm wondering, how is it being affected by this current red hot housing market? And I've seen some anecdotal stories on Facebook about renters being evicted so that the properties can be sold. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. All really important questions, Len. Let's first talk about how significant is it in the state. If we looked at data, the New Hampshire Coalition to End Homelessness looked at data for state fiscal year 2020. So that would have been July 1st, 2019 through June 30th, 2020. And really important to know those dates because we're only talking, about 4 months of the pandemic time, right? So important to footnote that as I talk about it. But during that state fiscal year, there was close to 4,500 people who were reported as homeless in the state of New Hampshire. And while that may not seem like a large number to other states that are significantly bigger, in New Hampshire, that's a pretty significant number to be concerned about. We're talking about adults, parents, children, the whole picture of the population. And what's even more important is then looking at, well, if we see that number, is it increasing? And I regret to say that, so we and the state of New Hampshire join the rest of the nation in something that's called a point in time count, which is an opportunity. It's one day every year in January that the entire nation is actually counting the number of homeless in our communities. And unfortunately, every category of homelessness last year in the point in time, so this would be the point in time in 2020, saw an increase of almost 21%. And so knowing that we've had this increase in total population of homeless, but also in these subpopulations is of great concern because again, that was before the pandemic hit. And so we know the pandemic had a huge impact on the homeless population and individuals who are under eviction. So to answer that last question that you asked about is, well, let's talk about the housing market and is it impacting? It's a difficult answer. The answer in short is yes, but it's a difficult one to answer right now because of the pandemic, because the CDC has actually imposed an eviction moratorium. And so people who may have been evicted, typically, if they're able to show that they are at risk of not being able to afford their housing because of COVID, and while many of our counties are still in substantial risk of COVID spread, they are protected right now from being evicted. But unfortunately, you're right. There are property owners who are wanting to sell or need to sell because the market's really hot right now and are in that situation of forcing people to be moving out and ending up homeless. And then we also have folks who are struggling because of COVID financially and are not able to afford their rent. So we really have this like worst case scenario that has really exploded during a pandemic when we already had a low vacancy rate across our state.
Is this a problem that's going to really blow up when this moratorium ends? Or if I believe the continuation of the moratorium through the end of the year is being challenged in court, if that suddenly ends, is this going to cause a huge increase in the problem?
Yeah, I think that is our worst fear. Right now, the moratorium is through October 3rd. And what we're hearing, and again, it's only certain counties. And if a county gets out of substantial risk, there's about 2 weeks that still is a safe spot for the moratorium for that tenant in that county. But you're right, unless we can help our tenants and our landlords know that there's a significant amount of federal funding that's come into the state that people can access to help pay their rent, pay landlords their back due all the way back to April of 2020. They can, if they didn't pay their rent in those months and it's still outstanding, they can reach out and apply with any of their community action programs that are in their local area. So we need to get the word out to try to prevent what you're describing, because advocates are very concerned. We're going to see a significant number of individuals and families ending up homeless, and our emergency shelter system cannot manage that capacity. It would be a significant risk of people. So what we want to make sure we're doing is getting the prevention dollars in their hands to prevent that situation from happening.
Are there federal funds available for it, and they're just not, like so many things, haven't been dispersed yet?
You know, believe it or not, they have been dispersed. They are currently available and tenants can absolutely access them today. It's not difficult to do. They can literally go to 211 and find out who their local community action program is. And then that community action program can help guide them through the application process. And even property owners and landlords, they can initiate it. They'll need their tenant to sign off in the long run, but they can even start the process if they have a tenant who hasn't been paying. And again, the moratorium right now is only in effect for, I believe it's 6 or 7 counties that are in considered substantial risk of COVID spread. And so those are the counties that are eligible for the eviction moratorium. But any county, any tenant living in any county is currently eligible to get those funds and apply for rental assistance. They go through the eligibility process. So we want to get that word out because it is available. I know we've often heard of federal funding that's waiting to be, dispersed. In this case, it's available, and people can contact 211 to find out more on how to make sure that they can maintain their housing, because there's not a lot of housing out there for them to move to, and there's not enough emergency shelters to sustain, what could happen if that many people become homeless.
Well, I think we're all hoping that it does. I'm presuming Hillsborough County, which we're in, is probably one of the counties that is still in the substantial risk area.
That is correct.
Now, because one of the things that I was surprised by when I read the state of homelessness report was the extent of the homeless problem outside the state's urban areas, outside of Manchester, outside of the greater Nashua area and some of the bigger towns on the East Coast. I guess the approach is, what role can the towns play in this when it's a problem that seems almost invisible outside the urban centers?
Yeah, it's a great question too, Len. So first, let's describe the problem, right? We know from last year's data that out of everybody who is homeless in our state, 45% are outside of urban settings. But what was even more startling was of those who are unsheltered, meaning they're not living in an emergency shelter, they're not doubled up on someone's couch, they're not under eviction, they're literally unsheltered, streets, living in camps, what you often would think of when you think of somebody who's homeless, living in a place not meant for human habitation. Of that population, 60% were outside of urban settings. So that's a pretty significant number when we're talking about surrounding towns and towns across the state that are not in urban settings. And you are absolutely right. People are startled by that data because this is the invisible homeless that we're talking about. It is the population that are so hidden that we don't even know it is existing. What I can tell you is there are some systems that know it exists. Our local welfare departments, our local welfare officers in our towns, they're aware of individuals who are struggling with homelessness. There are some outreach teams and other local organizations like community action programs who are aware because they may be reaching out for support. And so what we know is there's some awareness, it just may not be to the general public knowledge. And so our towns and our local towns, the smaller towns, are really needing to look at their welfare, to look at how do we help that population access the resources that do exist, like what we talked about from federal funding, and how do we help bolster our towns to understand that it does exist enough in our community that we need to be thinking about affordable housing being available in our community. It may not need to be every single apartment in that town, but is there a percentage in that town that could support those few citizens that are either homeless or really low income and need better affordable rent in their community?
Where do you find these populations, say, and take somewhere like rural Belknap, rural Stafford County? Are these the people, the ones you're going to find them in camps back in the woods, are squatting in abandoned houses? Witness the case of Miss River Dave there that's gotten a great deal of media interest of late. Where do these people go in some of these more rural towns? Manchester, we have bridge abutments, things like that. Smaller towns don't have that kind of infrastructure.
Yeah, we people who are experiencing homelessness become very resilient, right? For their safety, for their survival. So yes, they are often in abandoned buildings. They may absolutely just be in the woods in camp settings. Often they can be near, if there's railroad tracks in that community, they're near railroad tracks or rivers or lakes so that they have access to water. They may be doubled up. They may be living in someone's porch or someone's barn. It's, they may not have space in their house, but they're letting them stay in another piece of their property, but they can't stay there forever. So they're jumping around. We call that couch surfing. But sometimes that's a porch that's unheated as winter starts to get close again. Sometimes that's a barn. Sometimes that's a car. They're living in their cars. You name it, Len, there have been folks living in that situation. And so, regrettably, the individuals who are experiencing homelessness will find whatever they can for shelter. And we know that our towns don't all have emergency shelters, even in the wintertime, in the worst scenario. And so it's often cars and abandoned, buildings and things like that you'll find folks who are living homeless.
And that, I would presume, is why you find at some point homeless gravitating toward the urban areas, the Manchesters, the Nashua, because of the availability of services there.
Yeah, it's really tricky because, you often will find that people will want to go where they can easily access services. That's not wrong. However, they also want to stay in their community. And so how do we help communities wrap around the folks who are low income, homeless in a better scenario, knowing that that's where they want to be? That might be where their family members are. That might be where some of their services are. And so, it's a tricky balance because we don't want to flood the urban settings with additional need because they're over capacity already themselves, right? And so how do we help our local communities, our counties, our smaller areas respond to the need of the smaller number of homeless in their community, as opposed to having them move to another location that might have what they perceive as more services that are over capacity in the first place?
Well, I'm wondering too, and I've been a member of the local ZBA for quite a few years here, how things like New Hampshire zoning, which tends to favor large houses on large lots, how does things like zoning policy figure into that as far as getting more affordable units.
Right. There's a lot of roadblocks to getting additional affordable housing. Zoning is by all means one of them. There's a lot of misperceptions about what affordable housing might mean to a community. There's that assumption around it's going to mean more seniors who need more services, or that it's going to be a lot more children that are going to tap into, the education system and need more services. And so when we have those myths and those stereotypes out there, it makes it even harder to really think about, well, how do we at least provide some affordable housing in our community? In addition to that, there's not a lot of incentive to build affordable housing. How do we make sure that we have property developers who want to invest because it has good tax incentive, because it's not just about a good deed, right? It's about financially smart decision making. So there's this zoning piece, and our communities really understanding that there's a consequence to absolutely holding back opportunity for affordable housing when we have community members who need it. And then on top of it, getting property developers who are interested in doing it because it's financially feasible and operational long-term. So it's a bit of a tricky balance there. And we have a lot of work in the state. I feel like we've just gotten some great movement happening through the New Hampshire's Council on Housing Stability, who really identified some very specific goals and targets around both housing development, affordable housing development, and around homelessness and how to address homelessness so that it's rare, brief, and one time only for anybody who experiences it.
Could you talk about some of those goals a little more specifically?
Sure. So, when we look at both of them separately, and I have a little cheat sheet because the numbers are not as memorized for me, but the council set a very firm goal for itself. And it was to say that the goal would be to increase housing units by 13,500 by 2024, which is, it's such a great start to how do we address the affordable housing crisis that we have in our state. It's not saying it's going to be in this community or that community. It needs to be spread out across the state. And it is really saying that it needs to move at a quick pace, but we also have to be realistic. Developing housing takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. And you mentioned earlier in the interview that there's even going to be opportunity. There are a lot of businesses that are moving out of their office spaces. There are a lot of empty hotels, places that are not going to be going back in. That might be opportunity for developing housing that we can help communities realize. And so that's a part of this goal. In addition, on the homeless side, so that's the affordable housing side. The homeless side is, again, how do we make homelessness rare, brief, and one time only? And some of the key ways of doing that is prevention. If somebody is at risk of losing their housing, how do we help them prevent that from happening? That is a lot of the federal funding that we just talked about, and ongoing prevention money that needs to be available so families can pay their rent and not even end up homeless in the first place. And then for those who do end up homeless for whatever reason, that we are able to have a system that can quickly get them into affordable housing, maybe with services if needed, and the ability to get them in the shelter and out of the shelter as quickly as possible because we have resources on the other side. It's a tall order to accomplish, and we're only going to do it in bite-sized pieces, Len. This isn't going to happen overnight. But to finally have something in writing for the state to say, this is the mark we're going to make and this is the direction we're going to march, to me, that was half the battle. And we have stakeholders at the table who are committed to making some progress in this issue.
You mentioned families. Of the homelessness problem in New Hampshire, how does that break down? I think most people think of the homeless in terms of, the disheveled guy panhandling on the street or whatever, but how many families are homeless even temporarily?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in the 2020 state fiscal year, there were actually 1,500, about 1,500 people in families. So we know that makes up a lot of children who were homeless during that year, and may have been homeless for a short period of time or an extended period of time. And that's counting families who are living in our shelters or in our transitional housing programs, like Families in Transition has. 1,500 is a big number. That's a lot of people. But I have to tell you, it's probably grossly understated. And the reason for that is families often will end up in doubled up situations and we don't have enough emergency shelter beds in order to sustain what is likely out there for homelessness with families. And so many families, like I said, end up couch surfing, and they're usually learn about their homelessness through the school system. If their children are homeless, somehow along the way, the schools are finding that out. And so schools actually have very different data than even what we're able to report, because they're capturing a lot of that doubled up scenario. So family homelessness has such a big ripple effect on our kids. It affects their schooling, it affects their health. And how do we break that cycle so that they're not then circling into homelessness is such an important thing for us as a state to continue to work on.
And it's a disconcerting problem to think of that many children where sleeping on the couch at grandma's house, say, is not a fun thing.
Exactly. And how do we keep things consistent? There's some amazing laws out there. I could end up living with my child on my grandmother's couch in Goffstown, right? And then, but I came from Derry. I came from Keene. That's where my kids went to school, right? And then I landed in Goffstown. There's some amazing laws that are making sure that kids can stay in their original school of origin if they're homeless. And that's fantastic, right? We don't want kids to jump around in their education either. However, I got to tell you, that's still a difficult burden. It's a burden for the two schools. It's a burden for the families to get their children to that location for school. Most parents will do it because kids changing schools is never a good thing. If we can prevent it, we try to. And when you're homeless, you may bounce around a lot. So it is a huge impact on kids, and not something that we want to continue to see happen.
Certainly not. Let me ask you something, going back to housing issues, a very interesting piece that I saw the other day about the fact that New Hampshire is one of the only states I think the only state in New England that doesn't have a law against discrimination over the source of rental income, which leads to things that I have heard myself and ask whenever multifamily housing is proposed in an area. The cry of Section 8, Section 8, Section 8 goes out to, raise everyone's hackles. You think that getting rid of or making a law that they couldn't discriminate against rent vouchers would be a good idea in the long term?
The New Hampshire Coalition to End Homelessness definitely thinks that, because again, that's the stigma that's being tied to Section 8, right? If we have what are now called housing choice vouchers and rental assistance, it allows a family to stabilize. It actually is a positive in the long run, because they are able to stabilize. Their kids are going to go to the right school and stay in that school system. It is such a stigma and a discrimination that is coming with it when we hear cries like that. And you're right, as being, we're a live free or die state, right? So we're definitely sending the message to our families and individuals who are low income that they are supposed to take care of themselves. But the reality is we've had decades and centuries of systems that have really forced anybody who's in low income to be stuck there. And their ability to get outside of that by not having help, even if we're talking about our seniors, who suddenly find Social Security isn't cutting the mustard to pay the rents that we need to pay in our communities. Without the rental assistance, we're creating a scenario of increased homelessness and other issues that come with homelessness. And so really having affordable housing and not discriminating against Section 8 could actually do better for our community in the long run. And there have been some amazing communities who have embraced it, who've embraced workforce housing, who have embraced saying we need more affordable housing. And I think, we can learn from those communities as to how do we support other citizens in our community to say, these folks live here already. So how do we support them to make sure that they're stable, just like you and I might be stable if we're not low income?
For anyone who's lived, those of us who've been a couple of paychecks away from disaster, familiar enough.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about families in transition and some of their local programs. Can you talk a little bit about I know that you run transitional housing and various other programs in the Manchester area. If you could talk a little bit about those.
Yeah, absolutely. So Families in Transition really provides a continuum of housing and services, from emergency shelter for adults and families, all the way through to permanent supportive housing and transitional housing, right up to just straight affordable housing. And so what I mean by that is a lot of our housing is providing apartments or congregate settings for people to live in a permanent setting and get supportive services to help them sustain their housing. Homelessness comes with a lot of baggage, a lot of barriers. And so we want to make sure that they have the supports with them to be able to sustain their housing long term. And then we do that by wrapping around case management services. We have a substance use treatment center in Manchester that our Willows Substance Use Treatment Center is for any community member. So if there's a community member in Goffstown who's struggling with addiction, they can come to the Willows Substance Use Treatment Center. They don't have to be homeless and they don't have to be living in Manchester. They can come to the treatment center as well. So we know that substance use is one piece of an impact on a community and also on homelessness. So we created this treatment center as a response to that. We have Outfitters Thrift Store, and our thrift store is an opportunity to raise funds for the organization's mission. We're always looking for donations, and it is an opportunity for us to support some of our folks who are moving into their apartments by giving them a voucher to the thrift store to be able to go shopping for maybe some furniture, maybe some clothing for their children, maybe it's household items that they need to set up their new apartment. So not only is the thrift store a community resource for people to go who love thrifting to donate to as well, but it also supports our participants in the program, both financially through the programs and also through the vouchers. And then lastly, it's important to understand we really are trying to meet the need of housing in general. So if we see opportunities to build and renovate affordable housing without services, we do that as well. So we have units in Manchester that are just straight affordable, no services attached, because we know there are populations in our communities that desperately need affordable housing. We have a project under construction right now that will have 11 units of permanent supportive housing here in Manchester. And again, that is really just adding to the roles of housing that is needed in our community. It's only 11, but thank goodness it's 11, right? Every little piece is helping meet the need.
Well, I thank you very much. We got about 2 minutes left. If you've got any closing thoughts that you would like to add, we appreciate it. You've given an incredible amount of information today, and I think we could go on talking for another hour or two about it, because it is a very, very important issue, both to the town and to the state. So with that, if you have anything to add, please do.
Sure. Len, you're right. Homelessness is very intricate, and a half an hour doesn't even touch what it really is. I encourage folks to go to our website, the New Hampshire Coalition to End Homelessness. You can Google that. It'll take you right to our website, and we have a plethora of more information on homelessness, and you're welcome, anyone, to reach out. We're happy to talk further with anyone that wants to learn more. But also have access to our State of Homelessness annual report. And our next one will be out this December, learning more again about homelessness in this past year. But we're happy to have folks go to our website to learn more, as well as Families in Transition's website if you want to learn more about specific responses to addressing homelessness as well. The coalition is under the umbrella of Families in Transition. So fitnh.org, you can go to that website as well to learn more about Families in Transition. And again, I can't thank you enough for having us on. We appreciate the opportunity to talk about the coalition and about homelessness in our state.
Well, we thank you very much, and I must get you to promise to come back and visit us again to explore this topic a little bit more. Thank you very, very much for being with us today. Thank you, folks. You can watch these programs here on Goffstown TV, our local public access cable channel. We show them on our website, goffstowndems.com. You can search for Goffstown Democrats and find our YouTube channel. Or you can visit our Facebook page, facebook.com/GoffstownDems. Please like them, please share them widely, and thank you for being with us today.